Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for that wonderful intro. It's great to be here in Silicon Valley, the center of everything. I have a show of hands. How many people have picked up their smartphone today? How many people have checked email? How many people have used social media? Okay, if you didn't raise your hand, I'd like to talk to you after about how you've resisted the irresistible lure of the things that Silicon Valley has created and made. So today I'm going to be looking backward in order to look forward. I'm a historian. I became a historian because I believe that history is not just important and fun to know, but also is absolutely essential in understanding our present and also planning for our future. So here we are now in the center of everything, Silicon Valley 2020, a place whose social media companies, probably we have about 8 billion users worldwide that are using the platforms, social media platforms alone. This is the center of hardware, software, and it is not just a place, but a mindset, a shorthand for a whole set of industries. But it also is a place that has come up under a lot of scrutiny in the last few years. That the great love affair that the world had with the Valley seems to have been followed up by a really bad breakup. And so that whether we call it the techlash or something else, there is a lot of criticism about things that the Valley, particularly the largest American technology companies, are doing and have doing. And the part of this is a consequence of the Valley being very different from the way what it has been in the past. The fact that we are the saturation level of all the technologies that come out of here. And what's so remarkable about this place being the center of everything now is if you go back 100 years, this was very different. This was a place where the San Jose Chamber of Commerce main event wasn't, something like this. It was Prune Week, where the slogan was "Eat a prune a day, keep the doctor away," which is very good advice. But this was an agricultural region. It was industrial agriculture. It was industry. It wasn't just small-scale farming, as you all know. But how did we get from there to here? And what explains there were so many other places that could have become the center of the American technology industry, the global technology revolution. Why here? What was it? And how can that process, that history, help us understand where we go next? Well, in addition to prunes and apricots and other fruit, one thing that set the Silicon Valley or the Santa Clara Valley of 1920 apart from the rest of other agricultural valleys in California was Stanford University, which had been founded in 1885, opens its doors a few years later. But by the time in 1920, it had established a research reputation, but I think all the Cal alumni in the room will be pleased to know that it wasn't quite Berkeley. It was not the Harvard of the West. It was, pretty good, but not world class. But nonetheless, it was here, and it already was becoming a catalyst for high tech, a very small cluster of what we would call high tech companies in and around Palo Alto and nearby, including famously Federal Telegraph, which is founded in Palo Alto in 1909. Stanford graduates are its co-founders and its early employees. And in Federal Telegraph, we see some seeds of the electronics revolution to come. Like many, many startups after it, Federal Telegraph specialized it was about communication, wireless communication devices. Small electronics and communication devices have been a hallmark of the technologies produced out of here for years. It also was, like other startups after it, got its big break when it got a military contract in 1913 with the Navy to develop wireless technologies for the Navy. So the government and the military in particular played a big role in getting it going. But in 1920, you could go across the country and you could find clusters of companies kind of like Federal Telegraph or the other radio and wireless-oriented companies that were here in the Bay Area in the 1920s. You could go to Dayton, Ohio. You could go to Cleveland, Ohio. You could go to Rochester, New York. You could go to Detroit, Michigan. You could find lots and lots and lots of startup clusters and a lot of other places that seemed that they might have more of a chance to become an economic capital, a center of new technology. This was still far, far away. This was still remote. There was, and including, there wasn't any indication at this point that the growing industries of computing, which at that time was analog business devices and calculators, and would have anything to do with this place. That was all on the East Coast. The electronics industry was all on the East Coast. So what was the turning point? The turning point was 1940s and 1950s, World War II and the Cold War. And this is the first really important lesson for understanding how Silicon Valley came to be, but also I want us to think about how this can help us think about where Silicon Valley goes next. The Cold War is over, but government, the role of the federal government and other governments has always played a major, major part in explaining how this place grew and why. That we often think of the Valley as an entrepreneurial rocket ship, right? And it is. It's extraordinary stories of amazing companies, one generation after another. People who were able to develop technologies, bring them to market, change the world, have a transformative effect on so many things. But it was an entrepreneurial rocket ship with a big government launchpad. And this is what I mean by that. So as the Cold War begins in the late 40s and 1950s, we still have the Santa Clara Valley, we still have orchards and canneries being the main attraction. But two really important things change. And this is an example of local level choices and people taking the initiative, meeting these big macroeconomic changes. Opportunity flowing in the direction of California and the West, which California saw the disproportionate amount of military spending during the Cold War happened out here on the West Coast. But also there were local actors and institutions and choices and happenstance that happened to make this region take advantage of that opportunity. One was the choice by Burbank-based Lockheed to locate its Missiles and Space Division in Sunnyvale in 1954. And this was there were a variety of reasons it located here. One was it was a major defense contractor. This was the Cold War. There was great concern about civil defense and having too much of one industry concentrated in one place, so dispersing activities across geographic areas. So if the Soviet bombs hit, you wouldn't, wipe out all the capacity all at once. That was one reason they came to Sunnyvale. They also came to Sunnyvale because there was existing aerospace activity. There was the government military activity here. They also came to Sunnyvale because there was Stanford. And the other thing that happened in the 40s and 50s is that Stanford, kind of tired of being in the middle of the pack, led by its Dean of Engineering, then Provost Fred Terman, who's a name that may be familiar to a number of you in this room, made a conscious decision to remake itself to become the perfect Cold War university. It built up physics, it built up engineering. Disciplines like history kind of got the short end of the stick. But that created a perfect receptacle for this newly reinvented world that was precipitated by the federal government getting in the research and development business in a big way. And Lockheed also located its Missiles and Space Division here because Stanford was here, and they knew they could get people. They could work with Stanford, partner with Stanford. And so this close, tight partnership between these two magnets, Lockheed and Sunnyvale, and Stanford and Palo Alto, became the genesis of a growing electronics industry. And so by the time you get to the late 1950s, you have a lot of these East Coast-based electronics companies that are opening offices here in the Valley. It wasn't really startup land. One of the people I interviewed for the book, the late Burt McMurtry, a venture capitalist, a sort of Valley legend, said to me, you know, back in that time, if you started your own company, that meant you were weird and couldn't work for people. It was a very different world. Yeah, that's still the case sometimes. I heard that. But the other, and one of the things that draws these electronics companies here has to do with what the Valley is like. Peter just showed us the sprawling development of the peninsula of the South Bay and how there needs to be a mindful redirect of densification. But that open space, the ranchos that became great farmland, became it made it very, very easy for companies, both large and small, to locate here. There was land. And real estate developers are a big part of then and now the Silicon Valley story. Being able to go up to a farmer and say, I'll buy your acreage for this much. And the farmer says, that's a great deal. Sure, there you go. And then the bulldozers come, and a month later, you've got a tilt up and you have an office park. The ability to develop really fast and create a very accommodating space for the industry, something that is now, space is now the Valley's problem. But actually, it was its great regional advantage in the beginning, and that shouldn't be underestimated. Times are different now, but then this was something that catalyzed so much development here. But although the first electronics companies here were big guys, and Lockheed remained the biggest employer in the Valley through the late 80s. I tell people outside the region this, and even a lot of people here, and they're like, what? And partially it's because what was going on at Lockheed Missiles and Space, not much we could tell you about because it was classified. People who worked there couldn't go home and even tell their wives what they did for all day, much less appear on the cover of Fortune magazine being like, look, I'm an innovator. So it's this hidden story that's percolating throughout, but a very, very important piece of this big government piece of the Valley's history. But by the time we get to the late 50s, we're starting to see startup culture emerge. And of course, the granddaddy of them all is this company, Fairchild Semiconductor. This is a photograph that may be familiar to many of you in this room. These are the famous traitorous 8, the young engineers who come out to the Valley to work for transistor co-inventor William Shockley. The transistor, by the way, which was invented in New Jersey, just to underscore the fact that this was not the likeliest place to become a high-tech capital. But they come out here, they go to work for Shockley. They quickly discover he's, among his other faults, was the worst boss ever. So they all quit en masse, find venture funding, start their own company. And this is the template for, this is the company that everyone points to as like, this is the beginning. And of course, in this picture, you have Bob Noyce, co-founder of Intel. You have Gordon Moore, co-founder of Intel, of Moore's Law. You have Eugene Kleiner, founding partner of Kleiner Perkins, and on and on and on. It's the genesis of an entire semiconductor industry that puts the silicon in Silicon Valley. But here's a piece of the Fairchild story that doesn't get emphasized as much and helps underscore this big government foundation and how it worked. Because this wasn't just a matter of a whole bunch of, big government agencies opening offices here and the government telling entrepreneurs what to do. A lot of this spending occurred indirectly, competitively, and particularly in the case of the semiconductor industry, created a foundation for an incredibly competitive and eventually quickly commercialized advanced technology sector that couldn't have gotten its start in the same way or as quickly without its presence. And the real catalyst for what made Fairchild Semiconductor legendary was the space race. In early 1960s, John F. Kennedy declares we shall reach the moon at the end of the 1960s. What do you need to send an astronaut to the moon? You need very fast, very light, very powerful electronics. What are those? Who makes those things? What's the only place in the world that's making these things that don't have any commercial market to speak of, by the way? It's here. It's companies like Fairchild Semiconductor that by the early 1960s has developed the integrated circuit, a very powerful, very expensive, very boutique piece of electronics. NASA buys a whole bunch of them for the Apollo program. And in doing so, drives down the cost of production, allows it to scale up. And so by the 1970s, you have companies like Intel, companies like National, companies like AMD. You have the Silicon in Silicon Valley, and they're not defense contractors. Federal business might have helped them get their start, but they are commercial operators. They are putting microchips in everything from cars to all sorts of machinery. They are, and this is, of course, the first great homegrown cluster of industries here in the Valley. So the connection between entrepreneurship and government funding is a really important one. It's government funding that flows but gives entrepreneurs a lot of room to play around, iterate, play in their sandbox, throw sand at each other, build great companies. The US government built the industry in many ways, but did it in a way that made the industry feel like they did it on their own, and that's very important. But it also sometimes makes that connection hard to recognize. But that's not everything. Look, there were plenty of places that were defense hubs that had a lot of this spending going on. You had a lot of regions clustered. Boston was still the big guy until the 1980s. So what sets the Valley apart from the other high-tech regions that are emerging around the Cold War economy? Well, it's great products. It's the technologies that are being produced here. But it's also the story and how these products are explained and how Silicon Valley companies and leaders become very, very good at explaining to people how computer hardware and software is going to change their life, and bringing people on who weren't techies into the computer revolution. And part of this has to do with context. One of the things that I talk about in my book is how we have to understand the history of this place nestled within the broader economic and political history of the United States and the world. What else is going on in the 1970s as the personal computer industry is getting its start here? Not a lot that's good. Right? You open Business Week and take an issue of Business Week from the late 70s, early 80s. It is bad news everywhere. Japanese competition, factories closing, And then nestled in the middle of the issue, in the information processing section, there's stories of companies like Tandem Computer, where you have beer bashes every Friday, and you have a company swimming pool, and a picture of the CEO standing by the swimming pool. It's a totally different image of what a company can look like. It's a phoenix rising out of the ashes of the stagflating 1970s. It's something entirely different. It's American created, and it's something that politicians and the media grasp onto as this is the next big thing. This is where we need to go. It's aided by the presence of incredibly powerful and persuasive storytellers like Steve Jobs, who was very good at explaining to a much wider public and a wider audience of investors and media, this is how a computer can change your life. Apple did not invent the personal computer, yet it was claiming as such this is a banner ad that appeared as Apple was preparing to go public in the Wall Street Journal. This was August of 1980. This is a story that Jobs would say again and again. When we invented the personal computer, we created a new kind of bicycle, a bicycle for the mind that enhances human ability. So the Valley launches into the public consciousness in the 1980s with these consumer-facing industries, personal computing, and also video games. And all of a sudden, Silicon Valley is a place that people outside the valley know of. It's a term of art people know. And it grows large, but continues to grow large, partially because of its suburban geography. This is a detail of a map of the valley created in 1981, and it's all cars and it's all single-family homes. It's really this is the landscape of the valley is also aiding the growth, but the congestion and the crowding and the unsustainability of it is already becoming apparent as the valley starts to boom. The last thing that is really important at this historical lesson of understanding why the valley became what it is and what we need to understand about it now to go forward is this chain of connections from one generation to the other. One of the secrets of this place is time. There's just been a lot of time for people to gain expertise in an industry and to pass that expertise on to others. Where you have for people to build wealth and for that wealth to be reinvested, for patterns of mentorship and connection to grow over time. And because of those things, it becomes over time a magnet for talent where people from elsewhere come here to build companies, consciously pick up and move, know that they only can do what they want to do here. This happens in the 90s with the dot-com companies that usher in the internet revolution, including Netscape. Mark Andreessen here, fist pumping on top of the computer, is a great example of a young guy. He's in Illinois. He's a graduate student. He and his team have to come here to build their company, to be surrounded by these networks of expertise for people like Jim Clark, Jim Barksdale, Kleiner Perkins, the people with experience who are helping usher these young people, these young men, into and build a next generation. And again, one generation builds on another. The same thing happens with the companies like Facebook, the icons of this era, that grow over time, these networks of money and mentorship. But of course, as we've discovered, this is part of Silicon Valley's secret. It also is it's one of its weaknesses. It makes it hard to open up opportunity to people outside that network, to think about ideas that might not have been proven in the last generation in terms of how to run a company, how to grow, what your priorities should be. And so now we have a valley that is there are two valleys. There's the valley of those who are fortunate enough to live close in, to have to sort of the life of at the Googleplex where it's always sunny and you never have to wear a bike helmet. Google is really Stanford Graduate School turned into a company. That was the motivating. It's much more than that, but that certainly was the origins of its culture. Life is good. But it also is now a region of epic supercommuters. This is an image from an article that came out last week that Russ was quoted in about people getting on the bus in Salinas at 2:30 in the morning to commute to the Tesla factory. So how do we wrestle with some of the things that made the Valley great are actually hampering it now? Where do we go from here? Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is look at what made it great in the first place and what does that look like in 2020 and beyond. And it's about investing in place. This place had distinctive characteristics that made tech grow here. Now we need to reckon about what are the characteristics of place and what do we need to do with the built environment, with the landscape, with the policy environment that enable tech to be sustained here and for the next generation to grow. Institutions, not only Stanford, but also public institutions, public higher education institutions. One of the secrets of Silicon Valley is the California State University system of the 1960s, where you could go for $50 a semester. An incredible escalator of opportunity. Incredible escalator of opportunity that is now harder and harder to get on. It's investment in people. And it's giving people, not just the people who come in with all the opportunities, giving people who don't have opportunities to get them. So let me end with this picture of people who all became multimillionaires, right? The men in this picture all came from really modest backgrounds. If you were coming out and you were coming out to California in the 1950s, it meant you didn't have an Ivy League education or connections through your father to a job in banking in New York. It meant you didn't go to prep school usually. These were small town boys from the middle part of the country, scholarship kids, who got on this amazing escalator of opportunity, which was the product of investments in the state of California made in education and human capital, investments in place, investments in institutions, and investments the federal government was making in shooting the moon. And that, we need to reinvent that, to think about how we get to the next Silicon Valley. Because we're not always going to be on top just automatically. In 1920, when Prune Week was the biggest thing happening in San Jose, the most innovative place in the world was Detroit. Detroit is still a center of immense innovation, but Detroit is also now an example put up of this is what happens when a city, of things that can go wrong with a city, with its economy, when you don't invest in place and people. And so as we look to 2020, and we look beyond 2020, let's think about where's next? How does Silicon Valley function in a world where Silicon Valley is everywhere geographically, where you can be a nomad in Bali in an internet cafe and you can run your startup from there? And that sounds kind of nice. I live in Seattle, so I'm always, that's very alluring. But more importantly, who's next? How do we enlarge that opportunity? How do you diversify the faces and the people, but also remembering that this has been an amazing escalator where people like Bob Noyce, preacher's kid from Grinnell, Iowa, goes on to be Bob Noyce, right? So where's the next Bob Noyce? Where's the next Gordon Moore? And what can we as a community do to bring them into opportunity? Thank you very much.